The Danish Prime Minister is weighing in after Donald Trump abruptly and on Twitter canceled a plan.
Over to Europe now, where Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has been racing across the continent, trying to shore up support from allies. That following Donald Trump's repeated threats over Greenland.
We are facing a more uncertain reality, a reality that calls for an even more united Europe.
Dear President Trump, listen very carefully. Greenland has been part of the Danish kingdom for 800 years. It is not for sale. Let me put it in words you might understand. Mr. Trump, go.
The Arctic has long been regarded as an unapproachable, far-off, and freezing barrier. However, one of the biggest prizes of the century is hidden beneath the ice. The world chuckled at the notion when Donald Trump first laid eyes on Greenland. The next altercation, however, was serious. The headlines swirled, Denmark remained steadfast, and Greenland refused to be purchased. However, another country slipped in with billions on the table, while the focus remained on Trump's rage. Was this the actual pivotal moment? And who really has the power to decide the North's future? A country of quiet and ice, Greenland has always felt far away. However, beneath its icy exterior is a battlefield influencing the direction of global power, security, and energy. One question loomed over Washington, Copenhagen, Ottawa, and Brussels as what had once seemed like political theater quickly devolved into a crisis. Who would decide the future of the Arctic? Years prior, Donald Trump had proposed purchasing Greenland, causing politicians to chuckle and making headlines that ridiculed the idea. However, the tone shifted when he came back to power in 2024. Greenland was proclaimed an American objective and was no longer considered a joke. The president presented the territory as a question of dominance rather than collaboration, arguing that it was necessary for U.S. security and survival. Greenland is a fantastic location. We required it for global security. Almost immediately, his rhetoric changed from one of negotiation to one of demand, changing the Arctic. Resources were at the center of Washington's attention. Buried deep beneath the rock of Greenland, Greenland was a blind hole in the northern shield of America for military strategists. While China invested in northern infrastructure and transport lines, Russian submarines were already pushing farther into Arctic regions. Because of its location between North America and Europe, Greenland provided prospective staging grounds and radar coverage that Cold War planners had previously sketched but never fully implemented. Minerals weren't the only thing on the island. The goal was to secure the northern boundary before competitors did, and it was about military reach. Within the White House, Trump directed his security team to bring back outdated plans for Arctic defense. Proposals for long-delayed air bases and Cold War procedures were abandoned. Public declarations solidified in a matter of weeks. Trump referred to Greenland as if it were a resource and a missing component of America's protective wall strategy, stating that the area is essential to the existence of the country. He publicized his resolve for the world to see, prodded Denmark with ultimatums, and lobbied Congress for assistance. Copenhagen reciprocated. The Prime unwilling to allow the argument to drag on, Minister Mette Frederiksen flatly rejected the push. She maintained that neither pressure nor money could change the fact that Greenland belonged to Greenlanders. Denmark framed the problem as an attack on the alliance's reputation rather than a debate over policy, turning it into a NATO issue. Early in 2025, NATO's stance became clear. Strong-arming Greenland would be viewed as a betrayal of confidence. As a sign that the region would not be ceded, Allied ships passed through the waters surrounding Greenland, and exercises expanded throughout the Arctic. For Greenland, the crisis turned into a turning point. Greenland's political parties came together across the spectrum, no longer willing to be viewed as pawn. After passing a resolution denying any claim to sovereignty, Parliament took additional action by changing the rules governing the economy. Laws mandated that foreign miners hire Greenlandic laborers, with profits going to a national wealth fund and environmental protections regulating growth. Greenland was announcing more than just opposition. It was asserting its position as a growing force in Arctic politics. Another capital moved stealthily forward as Copenhagen defended and Washington intensified. Where others saw conflict, Ottawa saw an opportunity. With support from Europe and agreement from Greenland, Canadian companies started securing alliances that would transform the northern mineral economy. The agreements were made by the spring of 2025. Greenland's resources were linked to long-term European supply networks through more than $3 billion in Canadian investments. Greenland Resources and Sand obtained a 30-year mining license for molybdenum, a rare metal essential to the making of steel, with contracts that direct production to European companies. Another Canadian business, Amaroq Minerals, brought back to life delayed gold, silver, and copper projects that were supported by private investors who preferred collaboration to confrontation, as well as by Danish and Norwegian public funds. Where Washington's coercive economic pressure failed, this tactful approach worked. Canada partnered rather than threatened. By supporting Greenland's own sovereignty objectives and development, Ottawa was able to acquire resources that others had just requested and win trust in the process. The United States faced swift repercussions. As supply channels tightened, defense contractors who were already reliant on rare minerals frantically scurried. Delays and increased expenses were warned about by Lockheed Martin and others. The minerals that had appeared to be headed for America were suddenly locked into European agreements, causing shortages for clean energy projects linked to federal sourcing restrictions. Washington's approach has snatched influence and opportunity away. Frustration bubbled over in Congress. Lawmakers from Maine and Alaska condemned the government for severing ties with allies rather than forming alliances. Others advocated for a new framework that focused on collaboration with Denmark and Greenland. But the momentum had already been lost. Greenland had established its alliances, passed its legislation, and made its stance known. The United States' window of influence was already closed. Trump's strategy caused public opinion to change throughout Europe. The American push was first characterized by the media as a colonial fantasy. Danish polls showed a decline in public confidence in Washington, particularly among younger people. Business executives took action to reroute their investments, directing them toward energy and infrastructure agreements with Greenland and Europe. Denmark had taken American leadership for granted for decades. That presumption was now coming apart. Canada, however, quietly emerged as the winner of Washington's errors. Its strategy was based on respect for Greenland's sovereignty and consistent diplomacy. Canada gained reputation, influence, and access by supporting Greenland's own goals for resource management independence. Greenlanders gained work, Canadian businesses made money, and Europe had dependable supply lines thanks to the collaborations. It was a sharp contrast. Ottawa used cooperation while Washington applied pressure. While the U.S. made its demands known, Canada quietly negotiated accords. The distinction was evident to NATO allies. Denmark, while the U.S. appeared to be falling farther behind, Norway, France, and others viewed Canada's strategy as the way forward for Arctic development. Washington watched from the sidelines as what started as an American effort to increase its influence in the Arctic came to an end. Instead of being purchased or conquered, Greenland gained self-determination, shaped its own destiny, and attracted billions of dollars in investment. Denmark defended its position. Canada became an unexpected leader in the north, and NATO strengthened its solidarity. Trump's approach shown that world power is no longer unified through strong assertions, but by fostering relationships and establishing trust. That fact was put to the test in the Arctic. Once thought of as a frozen frontier, Greenland became the setting for the writing of a new power structure. Ultimately, Greenland stood up for its independence. Canada got a spot. Europe consolidated its power, and the United States left with a diminished strength. Through Alaska and the Thule Air Base, America continues to maintain its presence in the Arctic. However, its impact has unquestionably diminished. However, the U.S. had formerly held a stance of silent supremacy in the North. During the Cold War, the Thule Air Base in Greenland provided strategic depth, and Alaska provided a straight Arctic border. But those positions are no longer secure. Washington failed to account for the Arctic's rapid political and climatic change. Some American leaders took action while others debated. China positioned itself as a near-Arctic state and invested billions in port expansion, mining projects, and Arctic research stations. Russia set up military installations, nuclear submarines, and icebreakers throughout its frozen shoreline, considering the Arctic to be its jewel in the crown. To increase its sovereignty, Canada surveyed its seafloor and increased the size of its patrol ships. Even the European Union bolstered their claims and established energy alliances under the leadership of Denmark and Norway. America's previously presumed edge was eroded with each move. The world was surprised by a decision taken by Donald Trump against this backdrop. He suggested purchasing Greenland because he thought it might be incorporated into American territory similarly to previous land purchases. The reasoning was obvious. Rich in rare earth minerals, Greenland was ideally situated in the North Atlantic and at the center of any struggle for control of the Arctic. However, the strategy exposed more American flaws than strengths. Denmark categorically dismissed the plan as ridiculous. The concept was viewed as offensive by Greenland, which was developing a sense of national identity. The bid revealed America's diminishing might rather than changing the map. Where Washington used to command it, it now looked awkward and out in touch with 21st century realities. Other countries quickly took advantage of the error. China made significant investments in Greenland's mining sector, focusing on uranium and rare earth minerals that are vital to contemporary technology. Russia and Denmark expanded their Arctic energy exploration collaboration. In order to establish authority over the Northwest Passage, Canada built ports and ice-capable ships as part of its own northern infrastructure expansion. Over time, the Arctic power map started to shift, and the focus was shifted away from states. The explanation was straightforward. While others sought long-term tactics, Washington had depended on legacy strength. In order to accompany ships along the Northern Sea route, Russia constructed the largest fleet of icebreakers in the world, some of which are nuclear-powered and able to cut through ice all year round. The conventional route via the Suez Canal is longer than this one, which follows the Siberian coast of Russia. Controlling it entails controlling a future conduit for international trade. China is keen to lower its dependence on the Strait of Malacca to build maritime lanes, transforming the Arctic into a platform for their geopolitical alliance with Moscow. Europe also made deliberate movements. Norway increased the size of its defensive and drilling networks in the Arctic. By increasing investment, Denmark strengthened its control over Greenland and made sure that Copenhagen, not Washington, determined the island's future. The Arctic was linked to broader energy and defense strategy by the European Union, which acknowledged it as a vital security issue. Canada asserted its sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, announcing domestic waterways in spite of the U.S.'s protests. Washington's position gradually deteriorated. In the meantime, everything was changing due to science. Once impossible seas were opened by melting glaciers. New retreat recordings were added every summer, increasing the materials available. The Arctic seafloor may have oil deposits comparable to those in the Middle East. Beneath the granite of Greenland were rare earth elements that were essential for technology, batteries, and weapons. Countries realized that whoever was in charge of these reserves might influence future industries. The problem for America was that it didn't plan, it just reacted. In Washington, Arctic strategy announcements were sometimes made years later, with inadequate funding and a lack of cooperation. Military commanders issued a warning about the lack of icebreaking skills. The U.S. only ran a small number of ships that were many decades old, whereas Russia boasted dozens. Rivals took advantage of the disparity, which was evident to allies. With its advantage, Russia proclaimed large areas of the Arctic seafloor to be its continental shelf, a claim that crosses across into Canada and Denmark. It installed radar, deployed advanced air defenses, reactivated sites from the Soviet era, and hardened military outposts around the region. Moscow's intention to dominate was indicated by the submarines that prowled beneath the ice. China, on the other hand, presented the Arctic as a shared human legacy. However, its state-owned enterprises looked for vital transportation and mining assets. Its increasing prominence indicated a desire to influence Arctic administration in general. Despite its tiny size, Canada was a key player. By claiming sovereignty, Ottawa established itself as a gatekeeper of Arctic access by asserting its sovereignty over its northern archipelago and bolstering its claims with scientific surveying. It fortified settlements in the north, updated its coast guard, and established stronger connections with Europe. Taken together, these actions meant that American power could no longer control the Arctic. The speed at which this change occurred is what makes it so remarkable. The Arctic went from frigid obscurity to the focal point of global strategy in just one generation. Climate change hastened the process, and technology made resources previously thought to be inaccessible available. As the United States pondered, its opponents and allies took decisive and committed action. It is no longer a hypothetical contest. The Northern Fleet of Russia guards the oceans. Carving through melting ice are China's transport ships and research vessels. Norway and Denmark support NATO's northern flank. Waterways that are essential to shipping in the future are claimed by Canada. Despite the airbase in Greenland and Alaska, America's influence has decreased. It is losing control of the Arctic. This is a tale about influence rather than just land. Global trade may move away from conventional choke points if Arctic lanes are controlled. Mineral resources could determine technological dominance. Future confrontations may be decided by military placement. Every action in the Arctic has an impact outside of the polar circle, influencing alliances and economy. Whether Washington can adjust before it's too late is the question. Can it invest in Arctic infrastructure, make long-term deals with friends, and modernize its fleet of icebreakers? Or is it going to keep lagging behind as Europe, China, and Russia remake the map? The Arctic is no longer an inaccessible cold frontier. It is a battlefield for survival, fortune, and tactics. And countries and corporations are aware that the stakes increase as the ice melts. Whether it does too is up to the United States. What do you think then? Is America witnessing the permanent loss of its Arctic influence? Or can it still make a resurgence before competitors secure their edge?